Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, we gather here today not just to recount the annals of history, but to draw from them the fire that ignites our souls toward justice and humanity. Imagine, if you will, a time when empires rose and fell on the whims of madmen, when the mighty played with lives as if they were mere toys in a grand, tragic theater. In the middle of the 1st century, Rome was no longer resembled the stern republic of its ancestors. It had swollen into an empire of staggering wealth, sprawling from the misty hills of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Syria, and at its heart burned a city that considered itself the caput mundi, the head of the world. By the time Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ascended the throne in AD 54, at the tender age of 16, the old republican virtues of restraint, gravitas, and mos maiorum had been quietly buried beneath marble colonnades, imported silks, and rivers of Falernian wine. The Senate, once a gathering of proud patricians who could make or break consuls, had become a gilded cage of frightened old men who applauded on command and composed flattering verses between bouts of terror. Power, raw and unapologetic, now resided in one man, and that man was answerable to no law, no God, no conscience except the flickering moods that passed across his restless mind like clouds across the moon. Nero's Rome was a place of intoxicating extremes. The same city that could stage a triumph with elephants painted gold and captives in silver chains could also wake to find its emperor performing on a public stage, lyre in hand, demanding applause from an audience that knew a single yawn might cost them their heads. Palaces grew like tumors across the Palatine Hill. The Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house, would eventually swallow whole neighborhoods after the Great Fire of 64, its halls lined with mother-of-pearl, its ceilings revolving to shower guests with rose petals while perfumed water rained from hidden pipes. Slaves by the hundreds of thousands kept this dream alive, invisible hands polishing mosaic floors that depicted sea monsters and nymphs, cooking peacocks' tongues for midnight banquets, carrying litters through streets where the air was thick with incense, roast meat, and the metallic scent of blood from the arena. To be poor in Nero's Rome was to be nothing, to be beautiful or talented was to be in constant danger, because the emperor's gaze was a spotlight that could exalt or consume. This was an age when traditional boundaries dissolved in the heat of absolute power. Senators' wives openly kept actors as lovers, priests of Cybele castrated themselves in ecstatic frenzy on street corners, Egyptian cults promised rebirth while initiates drank from golden cups shaped like phalluses. Gender itself, that ancient anchor of Roman identity, began to slip its moorings. Men wore makeup and transparent silk from Kos, women fought as gladiators to the roar of the crowd. The emperor, who saw himself as Apollo incarnate, as artist, as god, felt entitled to reshape the world the way a sculptor reshapes clay. And when grief and obsession overtook him after the death of his beloved second wife, Poppaea Sabina, kicked, the rumors insisted, by Nero himself in a fit of rage while she was pregnant, he did not content himself with ordinary mourning. He searched the empire for a replacement, not for a new wife, but for a living replica, someone who could be molded, literally and mercilessly, into the image of the woman he had lost. This was the atmosphere into which a boy named Sporus, perhaps a slave, perhaps a freedman's son, perhaps simply a child of no importance whose beauty caught the wrong pair of eyes, was dragged from obscurity. Rome under Nero had become a machine that devoured the vulnerable to feed the appetites that grew more grotesque with each indulgence. A whisper from a courtier, a nod from the emperor during a banquet, and a life could be unmade before the wine was poured a second time. Castration, in that world, was not rare. It produced the delicate eunuchs who served in safer times served as bureaucrats and priests, but under Nero it became another brushstroke on the canvas of his fantasies. The knife, the hot iron, the forced healing, the dressing in women's stola and veil, all of it sanctioned by imperial will, applauded by a court that had long since learned to call cruelty by the name of sophistication. To understand Sporus is to stand at the epicenter of a culture that had traded its soul for spectacle, where the powerful could rewrite another human being's body and identity as casually as they commissioned a new fresco. It was a Rome drunk on its own might, blind to the rot spreading beneath the gold leaf, hurtling toward the day when 4 emperors would rise and fall in a single year and the empire itself would teeter on the edge of collapse. And in that dizzy, glittering, terrifying world, one boy's stolen manhood became the starkest possible mirror of what unchecked power could do when it convinced itself that another person's humanity was nothing more than raw material for its dreams. He was barely past childhood when they took him, 14, perhaps 15, the age when Roman boys began to dream of the toga virilis and the proud day they would shave their first beard. Sporus had no such future waiting. One moment he was simply another face in the endless river of humanity that flowed through the Sabura or lingered near the slave markets. The next, he had become the emperor's obsession, a living ghost summoned to replace a dead empress. The sources disagree on the exact details. Suetonius says Nero found him because of an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea. Cassius Dio claims the boy was deliberately hunted across the empire, but they agree on the brutality of what followed. Surgeons, probably the same specialists who castrated boys for the palace eunuch corps, were summoned. The operation was swift, practiced, irreversible. Hot knives, boiling oil to staunch the blood, bandages soaked in vinegar and myrrh. Sporus did not scream for long. Boys in that place learned quickly that screams only amused the watchers. When the fever finally released him, he woke to a body that no longer belonged entirely to him, to a voice already climbing toward the soft, unbroken register the emperor desired. Then came the dressing, the training, the relentless erasure. Nero named him Sabina, after the woman whose corpse still haunted his nights, though the nickname that stuck was Sporus, seed or semen, a cruel joke that reduced the boy to the single thing he could no longer produce. He was given Poppaea's jewels, her translucent silk stolas dyed with Tyrian purple twice dipped, her golden hairpins shaped like dolphins. Slaves painted his face each dawn, white lead for the skin, red ochre for the cheeks, coal to enlarge eyes already wide with fear. His hair, if it was not already long, was extended with switches taken from German captives until it fell in the heavy curls Poppaea had favored. He was taught to walk with the swaying gait of an aristocratic matron, to lower his eyes modestly, to laugh behind a fan the way the dead empress once had. Every mirror in the palace became an instrument of torment, forcing him to watch the slow murder of the boy he had been. At banquets he sat at Nero's right hand, a breathing statue of grief made flesh. When the emperor drank too much, he would stroke Sporus's cheek and weep openly, calling him, "My little Poppaea, my dove returned from Hades." Courtiers applauded the tenderness. No one dared remind the emperor that the dove's wings had been clipped by his own command. On the wedding day, if the grotesque ceremony can be called that, Nero paraded through Rome in the full regalia of a Roman bridegroom while Sporus, veiled in flame-colored silk, was carried in the bride's litter amid showers of nuts and obscene cheers. The marriage was registered in the public archives. Priests sacrificed to Juno Pronuba. The empire's laws, its gods, its ancient ceremonies, all were bent into the service of one man's delusion. Yet beneath the paint and perfume, beneath the forced smiles and the soft answers drilled into him by impatient tutors, Sporus remained. The body could be mutilated, the name stolen, the future erased, but something wordless and stubborn persisted. We glimpse it only in flashes, the way his hands trembled when Nero's fingers lingered too long on his throat, the split second of blank horror in his eyes when the emperor announced yet another public appearance, the rumor, preserved by Dio, that he sometimes tried to speak in his old voice when he thought no guards were listening. He became the perfect symbol of victimhood not because he was passive, but because his very existence was a silent accusation. Every forced smile indicted the entire machinery of empire that had collaborated in his destruction. Nero's courtiers called him the emperor's wife, laughed at the exquisite irony of a boy who could never betray his master with pregnancy or infidelity. They did not see, or refused to see, that Sporus had become the empire's wound made visible, a walking reminder that absolute power does not merely kill, it annihilates identity itself. He was not allowed to mourn the boy he had been, not allowed to hate the men who owned him, not allowed even the small mercy of invisibility. Every morning the mirror showed him Poppaea's face grafted onto his ruined body, and every evening Nero's arms reminded him that love, in the palace, was just another word for possession. In the end Sporus outlived his tormentor by only a few months. When Nero fled Rome in 68, throat slit by his own hand, the boy bride was claimed by the Praetorian prefect Nymphidius Sabinus, who planned to parade him as proof of continuity with the old regime. Then came Galba, then Otho, each new emperor inheriting the living doll like a piece of furniture from the Domus Aurea. Finally, in 69, during the chaos of Vitellius's rise, a mob dragged Sporus to the Forum and prepared to force him into a gladiatorial spectacle where he would play the rape of Persephone. Rather than endure that last humiliation, he found a private room and opened his veins. The empire moved on, already devouring its next set of victims, but for one brief moment a castrated boy had stood at the center of the world's stage, silent, unyielding, the purest embodiment of what it meant to be powerless beneath the Roman sun. Look at him long enough and the centuries collapse. The painted mouth, the borrowed hair, the body that was forced to speak a language it never chose. Sporus is not merely a name lost in the footnotes of Suetonius. He is the original wound from which every later story of stolen identity bleeds. He stands at the beginning of a terrible lineage, the child soldiers dressed as girls in warlords' camps, the comfort women branded with their captors' numbers, the transgender prisoners today who are housed according to the genitals they were born with rather than the selves they know themselves to be, the teenagers trafficked and surgically altered in back-alley clinics so they can be sold as the way Nero once sold an empire's dignity for one more night of pretend mourning. Sporus is the ghost that refuses to stay buried, because the crime committed against him never became obsolete, it only changed costumes. What was taken from him was not only flesh. It was the unbroken line between past and future that every human being carries inside the body like an invisible thread. When the knife went in, it severed yesterday's boy from tomorrow's man and left only an eternal, frozen present in which someone else's desire was the only law. That is the deepest violence power can inflict, not death, which at least grants the dignity of an ending, but the suspension of becoming. Sporus was condemned to remain forever on the threshold, neither the child he had been nor the adult he might have grown into, neither fully male nor female, neither slave nor free, neither dead nor truly alive. He became a living question mark written in scars, and every breath asking the same unanswerable thing, who has the right to decide what a human being is allowed to become? In that sense his story is the dark twin of every narrative of transformation we celebrate. We honor the caterpillar that dissolves in its chrysalis and emerges painted with new wings. We applaud the young person who finally steps into the truth of their gender or their calling. We write poems about exile and return, about death and rebirth. But Sporus reminds us that metamorphosis can also be violation. Not every cocoon is woven by the creature inside. Some are forced, spun from the silk of another's madness, and the wings that finally open are only the parody of flight. There is a difference between becoming and being unmade in someone else's image, and the line between those two things is drawn in blood and consent. Even the language we have for such experiences is borrowed from Sporus's nightmare. When we speak today of someone being castrated by criticism, of a voice cut off at the root, of a person dressed up and paraded for another's agenda, we are echoing, without knowing it, the vocabulary of imperial cruelty that was first perfected in the bedrooms of the Domus Aurea. Every time a dictator forces a dissident to confess on television in words not their own, every time a cult leader renames the recruits and dictates what they may wear, every time an abuser tells the victim, "This is who you really are," Sporus is there, watching from the corner of the room with painted eyes that have seen it all before. And yet, strangely, his story also carries the seed of the opposite truth. Because if identity can be stolen, it also means identity is not merely the body, not merely the name given at birth, not merely the role society demands. Something survived in Sporus that all the knives and mirrors and wedding veils could not reach. The historians, eager to turn him into a salacious footnote, record almost nothing of his thoughts, yet the very fact that he finally chose the manner of his dying, quietly, privately, on his own terms, shouts across 20 centuries that the core of him remained his own. The empire could take his testicles, his name, his future children, his reflection, but it could not take the ultimate no. In the last room he ever entered, he shut the door with a slave's soft footsteps and opened his veins like a man reclaiming the only thing still left to possess, the right to decide when and how the story ends. That small, enormous act turned Sporus from mere victim into a figure of terrifying ambiguity. He is both the warning and the mirror. He shows us how fragile the self is when power is unchecked, and at the same time how stubborn the self can be when everything else has been stripped away. He is the reason we must keep asking, in every age, who gets to define another human being's horizon. And he is the reason we must keep answering, with whatever voice we have left, no one. Not ever. Not even an emperor. Not even in the name of love. The first instinct is to turn away. The story is too ugly, too intimate in its cruelty, too loud with the sound of a child's life breaking. We want to file it under ancient history, a grotesque sideshow in the circus of Nero's reign, something that happened to people who wore togas and spoke Latin and therefore cannot really touch us. But that turning away is the final victory the tyrant wants. As long as Sporus remains a lurid footnote, the knife stays sharp for the next throat of the next powerless boy or girl who catches the wrong eye. The only way to blunt that knife is to look straight at the wound, to let the blood speak, and then to decide what kind of ancestors we intend to be. Resilience is not the same as triumph. Sporus did not overthrow Nero, did not lead a rebellion of eunuchs through the palace corridors, did not live to write his memoirs or found an empire of the freed. His resilience was quieter, almost invisible, yet more ferocious than any legion. It consisted of waking up every morning inside a body that had been declared public property and still finding, somewhere beneath the paint and the terror, a pulse that answered only to itself. It consisted of walking through Rome in the bridal veil while the crowd roared with laughter and refusing to let the laughter become the only story ever told about him. It consisted of waiting, for emperors, for new owners, until the moment arrived when he could close a door behind him and say, with the small authority death grants, this far, and no further. That is the fire we are invited to carry forward. Not the fire of vengeance, though heaven knows it would be justified, but the colder, clearer flame of memory that refuses to cooperate with oblivion. Every time we insist on telling the stories of the erased, we hand Sporus a voice he was denied in life. Every time we teach children that power without accountability breeds monsters, we build a small barricade around the next child who might otherwise disappear into silence. Every time we defend the bodily autonomy of even one trans kid, one trafficking survivor, one prisoner, one refugee, we reach back through time and place a hand on the shoulder of a painted, trembling boy in the golden house and whisper, "You were right to keep something for yourself." We are still fighting for it. There is a sacred rage that belongs to the victims, and it is not the property of any one politics or creed. It is the rage of the mother who sees her daughter's face in every missing person poster, the rage of the surgeon who repairs fistulas in girls sold before puberty, the rage of the teacher who watches a quiet student flinch whenever an adult man raises his voice. That rage does not shout, it organizes. It funds shelters, it changes laws, it sits in courtrooms year after year until justice stumbles out exhausted but alive. It remembers names. It learns the difference between sympathy, which costs nothing, and solidarity, which costs everything. And it knows that the opposite of tyranny is not freedom in the abstract but the fierce, daily labor of making sure no one is ever again turned into someone else's doll. Sporus also teaches us the stubbornness of empathy. In an age that grows daily more skilled at looking away, scrolling past the photograph, muting the video, closing the browser tab, his story demands that we practice the ancient, uncomfortable art of staying with the pain of a stranger. Not to colonize it, not to make it serve our own comfort, but to allow it to change us. The empathic imagination is a muscle. If we exercise it only on people who resemble us, it atrophies exactly when it is needed most. Sporus looked nothing like the senators who recorded his shame, nothing like the modern reader turning these pages, yet he is bone of our bone. To refuse him recognition is to refuse a piece of our own humanity. Finally, there is the unsettling gift of perspective. Compared to the knife that took his future, most of our daily complaints shrink to their proper size. Yet the story does not shame us into silence, it enlarges us into responsibility. If a castrated boy with no rights, no allies, and no tomorrow could still draw a line that the empire itself could not cross, then we, who have votes, voices, wallets, passports, platforms, have no excuse left. The same hands that once applauded Nero's wedding procession can become the hands that tear down the next stage built for humiliation. The same mouths that laughed at the bride with no choice can learn to speak the names the powerful would rather forget. So we do not tell this story to wallow in despair. We tell it the way a blacksmith holds iron in the fire, long enough to make it glow, not so long that it melts away. We hold Sporus in the hottest part of memory until his outline burns itself into conscience, until the shape of what should never happen again becomes unmistakable. And then we carry that shape out into the streets, the courtrooms, the classrooms, the voting booths, the quiet conversations where real change begins, and we say, without drama but without apology, never here. Not on our watch. Not to any child. Not in our name. The empire fell, the palace crumbled into dust, but the boy's refusal still stands, small and blazing, waiting for us to add our breath to his undying no. The story ends where most people expect it to end, with a boy's blood on a marble floor in the year of the 4 emperors. But that is only the ending of the body. The story itself refuses to die, Because every time we repeat it we are doing something different from Sporus that Nero could never own, the right to decide what his life will mean after he is gone. He becomes, against every intention of his tormentors, a citizen of the future. And citizenship brings obligations. We owe him, first, the duty of accurate memory. Not the voyeuristic thrill that lingers over the details of castration and forced marriage, but the disciplined, unflinching memory that says, this happened, these were the mechanisms, these were the silences that made it possible. We name the surgeons who accepted the commission, the courtiers who laughed, the priests who blessed the union, the historians who later reduced a human being to a spicy paragraph. We refuse to let the phrase, Nero's excesses, become a polite blanket thrown over atrocity. Precision is a form of restitution, vagueness is complicity continued. We owe him the duty of translation. His Latin is dead, but the grammar of domination is still spoken fluently in 1,000 languages. When a 15-year-old today is trafficked and surgically altered to look more marketable, when a non-binary prisoner is housed by birth sex and raped nightly, when a child bride is veiled and paraded while the men cheer, Sporus is in the room. His ghost does not haunt us out of vengeance, he haunts us out of unfinished business. The task of translation is to recognize the ancient pattern beneath the modern costume and to interrupt it before the knife falls again. We owe him the duty of vigilance at the places where power and vulnerability meet. That means watching the quiet bureaucracies, the foster systems that lose children, the refugee camps where boys disappear into protective custody, that is anything but, the talent agencies and modeling scouts and religious orders and elite sports programs that promise stardom and deliver ownership. It means noticing which bodies are treated as raw material for someone else's fantasy and asking, long before the scandal breaks, who profits from the erasure of consent. Nero did not act alone, he acted inside a whole civilization that had agreed, in advance, that some lives were disposable. We owe him the duty of imagination. Not the sick imagination that dressed a boy as a corpse, but the fierce, prophetic imagination that can picture a world in which no one is ever again declared surplus to someone else's grief. That world is not utopian, it is merely a place where the strong are afraid to do certain things because they know the rest of us will not stay silent. Imagination draws the blueprints, but memory supplies the steel. We build with both, or we build nothing. And we owe him, finally, the duty of joy. Strange as it sounds, joy is part of the debt. Because the opposite of turning a child into a doll is not merely the absence of cruelty, it is the presence of a life allowed to unfold in its own wild, unpredictable beauty. Every time a kid grows up free to become whoever they are, without mutilation or mockery, Sporus wins a victory he could not win in his own lifetime. Every time a survivor stands in front of a crowd and says, "This was done to me and still I am," the empire loses a little more dust. Joy is political. Joy is justice wearing its festival clothes. These duties are not heroic, they are ordinary, daily, stubborn. They look like showing up to city council meetings when someone tries to defund the rape crisis center. They look like teaching teenagers how to spot grooming before it spots them. They look like refusing to laugh at the joke that turns a human being into a punchline. They look like voting, donating, testifying, adopting, fostering, mentoring, listening until the story is told in the survivor's own voice instead of the perpetrator's. They look like parents who believe their child when they say who they are, and doctors who ask for consent instead of assuming it, and journalists who investigate power instead of flattering it. 2,000 years is a long time to wait for justice, but memory has its own calendar. On that calendar, Sporus is still a boy standing at the edge of the blade, waiting to see whether the future will finally turn its face toward him and say the words he never heard in life, "You belong to yourself. We were wrong to let them take you. It will not happen again." We say those words not with grand speeches but with the 1,000 small refusals that make the next grand speech unnecessary. We say them every time we choose, in whatever corner of the world we occupy, to make power afraid of indifference. That is how the living repay the stolen, by making the world a place where no one else has to pay the same price. The boy's blood has long since soaked into the marble and dried. But the echo of his no still travels, looking for hearts willing to carry it forward. When enough of us take it up, the echo becomes a shout. And the shout, one day, becomes the law written not on tablets of stone but in the bodies of children who are allowed to grow whole. That is the only monument Sporus ever asked for. That is the only monument worthy of him.